and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome everyone to this very, very special episode of Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs. I'm so pleased to say that I'm joined today by Mary Harrington, who is the author of a wonderful new book, which I have very much enjoyed. I've been wrestling with this book. I have. It's called Feminism Against Progress, and it's quite a short book, isn't it, Mary? But it's definitely value for money. I can certainly say that in terms of the ideas and the depth of ideas that's gone into it. So I've been really excited about this conversation, and thank you, Mary, for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great. It's great to have you, Mary. And genuinely, I think you're one of the most interesting voices on the scene, one of the most interesting intellectual voices speaking about these crucial issues, but not from a sort of, anodyne progressive perspective, but from a critical perspective, albeit one which is not, I know you actually describe yourself as a reactionary, but not reactionary in a bad sense, let's say. So Mary, I thought it'd be really interesting to start with the sort of autobiographical element of this book, because I think this is one of the things that makes it so engaging, is that your journey, particularly as regards feminism and your view of the world, has really been shaped by your own experiences beginning at university, and then your experience of becoming a mother, and then reevaluating your ideas and everything like that. So why don't we start with that? When you were at Oxford as an undergraduate, weren't you? And you talk about that in the book. So tell us a little bit about that, what it was like, and what you were taught at Oxford, and how that shaped your view of the world.
Well, I'll start a little bit before that. And I had I suppose you could call it a fairly recognisably classical education, although a slightly eccentric one. Which was very radically disturbed by coming across critical theory for the first time at Oxford. Now, I mean, just the 20 years have elapsed, give or take, since I went up to Oxford. And in the intervening period, the critical theory, which was taught to me as a bolt-on, has now consumed pretty much the entire academy.
Yeah.
So we're now somewhere quite different, but I was there, I suppose, fairly close to the start of that process. I remember reading the post-structuralists and thinking, Christ, just my goodness, this has just eaten the Enlightenment. This is Enlightenment. It was clear to me even then that a set of basic premises for the entire paradigm that I'd been living in up to that point were just no longer tenable if you took these ideas seriously. I mean, you wanted an engaging personal story, and this all sounds very dry, but I suppose I'm
not at all.
What I really want to underline is this wasn't a sort of intellectual thing. I mean, I suppose the characteristic of undergraduates is that they take ideas very seriously, or should anyway. If you're doing it right, you take the ideas, you sort of rhapsodize over Shelley or whatever, and just get far too into it, and that's why English students are so annoying if they're doing it properly. So there I was, being annoying in exactly that way, and taking these ideas very seriously, I sort of felt they should. And if you take those ideas seriously, it basically throws the entire the entire foundational premise of modernity out of the window. Leaves you with leaves you with what? That's really a question which I've spent a lot of time and bandwidth on pretty much ever since.
Yeah.
And what I've tried to underline in the way I've told the story in the book is that that's not just a sort of abstruse intellectual thing that you kind of play with a bit and then you get on with being a management consultant or whatever. Or it can be. I mean, some people really did just treat it like that. But for me, it just wasn't like that. It was a very personal thing. I found it devastating, actually, to have had my, the foundational sort of structure of my reality more or less just dismantled underneath me, and replaced with nothing very substantial and certainly nothing very comforting.
Mary, can I ask about that? Because I'd love to just jump in here, because this fascinates me when you say that you found it devastating, because I think on some level, I was an English literature student as well, as an undergraduate.
I'm sure you were less annoying than I was.
Pardon me, I didn't hear.
I'm sure you were less annoying than I was.
I may have. I was probably less hardworking than you were, I imagine. But the thing about it is I was, maybe because I wasn't as hardworking and I didn't go to as good a university as an undergraduate as you, but But I've never had that experience of being attracted to this way of thinking, if you see what I mean. I've been aware of this way of thinking, very aware of it, but I've never seen the attraction in it. And the thing I love about literature is the sense of it being a gift, something which is given to me, and it can be from the present, but often from the past, something that is passed on from one generation to another as something which is a treasure to be loved. And it seems to me that kind of, what the late Roger Scruton would have called that sort of debunking attitude is almost completely the opposite of what literature offers to the world. It's about identifying the sort of power structures that underlie the production of this material and exposing them for what they are, so that you can see the truth about these things, the corruption that's inherent within them, and then you can sort of not be manipulated by it, and you can overcome it or transcend it. But I guess my question is, what's attractive about that? Is it just that you sort of thought it was true, or what? Can you tell me?
Well, I mean, we're confusing a set of. The summary that you've given is good. I agree with it, but we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves a bit here, and we're definitely not on feminism, which is fine.
Sure.
This is the especially when I talk to men and women of the cloth. This is the interesting stuff. This is the crunchy stuff.
Right.
You're conflating there in your summary, which is accurate in terms of where we are now with postmodernism 2.0, two distinct things, or at least in terms of how I've made my peace with this theory. One is the basic insight that the world isn't something that we can stand outside and have a neutral opinion on. That's the basic insight, and also that language and a number of other things that, or at least that, and this idea that you can stand outside the world and have a neutral opinion on it obscures a number of things about how reality is put together. It obscures a number of it hides a lot of the stuff which is under the bonnet. But what you then make of lifting the bonnet and having a look at what's underneath, what you do with that, and how you interpret that, and how you make that make sense, is a completely different ballgame. And it doesn't necessarily follow for me that just because you can look under the bonnet of the sort of rationalist, neutral observer idea and discover that in fact language shapes meaning, and that systems of power or indeed material realities shape meaning, it doesn't follow from that this is something that we can or should try and escape. To me, all that follows from that is that in a sense we're inextricable from the world in a way which seems not to be the case in the sort of Enlightenment paradigm. Does that make sense? All of the sort of nihilistic interpretations of that, which have come later and which have turned into what Scruton calls this debunking attitude, those are not necessary. That's not the direction you have to take it in. That's just the direction which has congealed on top of the basic insight.
Okay.
So I mean, this is where this is the point I've arrived at after 2 decades of trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I think what you're saying makes sense, and you're right. We shouldn't jump ahead of the story, because I think people we've missed out. We've kind of gone straight to we've kind of gone straight to the sort of the theorizing analytical bit, which is where I think we probably naturally both of us would tend to go. But tell us what changed for you then. You were at university, you had this profound experience there. I mean, I one of the images that stuck with me is this thing you said about the spires of Oxford. Penetrating, penetrating the sky or whatever it might be. This kind of this sort of I don't know, rereading, alternative reading of the architecture of the Oxford skyline. But that was a very powerful image. So what changed? What happened? Well,
I suppose the short answer is I found the off switch.
Right.
I figured out how to function in ordinary life without always looking at it like that.
Okay.
I'm still. Partly, I can still look at the world in that sort of deranged kind of semiotic way if I want to. But I've also figured out that A, you need an off switch if you're going to function on an everyday basis, and B, you don't have to be paranoid about. But just in more concrete terms, I did my best being somebody who takes ideas very seriously. I sort of laugh at myself a bit in that way, but because I think most sensible people really just get on with life, but I take ideas very seriously for my sins. So I set about sort of trying to apply the postmodern insight to everything.
Right.
You know, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm sort of back rationalizing a kind of basic unemployability that was there for other reasons. I've no idea. Anyway, I was functionally unemployable. Right. In my 20s. I remember my dad saying to me with some frustration at some point, "I do wish, Mary, that you'd apply your not inconsiderable intelligence to the business of earning a crust," which is, you know, it was a fair point, because I was just chronically sketchy. Right. You know, I cyberloafed in all of my jobs. You know, quiet quitting was my sort of default setting, you know, long before it became a thing. You know, I spent all of my time noodling around on the internet, and my interests just weren't very, very compatible at all with, you know, doing anything useful that anyone was willing to pay anybody for, which was obviously not ideal from the point of view of, you know, having a stable place to live or building up any kind of a sort of solid functioning foundation for adult life. And I was just, and I suppose that the kind of the unifying, ironically, what all of these sketchinesses had in common was a sense that there couldn't be anything permanent, when even the fabric of meaning itself was moving around underneath me. Then, you know, the idea that anything of making a permanent commitment to anything just seemed absurd. Whether that was a permanent commitment to somebody else, or a permanent commitment to, even, you know, as permanent a commitment as taking on a mortgage, or taking on, you know, making a determined choice in favor of this career or that career. I just, all of it felt like anathema to me. I mean, ironically, you know, assuming that attitude is, as it turns out, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, is itself a choice. Yeah, of course. That leaves you with a reduced set of options in other ways. But I mean, that didn't cross my mind at the time. Yeah. Anyway, we are where we are, as they say in the Foreign Office.
Yeah. And sorry, carry on.
And the upshot of all of this was, well, I after a while, via these various experiments in living, experiments in being, experiments in, I had a group of friends who were doing vaguely sort of media art experimentally stuff. And a web startup sort of coalesced out of that, and out of common interests with a group of people. And we set about trying to make it happen. And I thought, well, actually, maybe this is something which is sufficiently aligned with the way I've been approaching up to the world up until now, to make for that to be a good fit. So I sort of threw myself into that. But I brought all of my chronic sketchiness with me, and as a consequence of that was fairly central to the whole project falling apart. You know, I take a lot of responsibility for what went wrong. It was devastating. It happened at the same time as the Great Crash in 2008, and it left me asking whether any of the stuff that I believed or taken seriously up to that point was really any value at all. Not least because what I'd been trying to grapple was this revelation which comes out of critical theory about systems of power, which had left me with a sort of a very visceral aversion to power dynamics in any way, shape, or form. Right. And a real and a sort of deep-rooted commitment to trying to live in a way which wasn't just complicit in all of those things. In a way which, you know, it's recognizably consistent with the worldview which now gets called woke. Right. Yeah. I mean, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. I'm sort of telling the story from the inside out a bit, but it's, you know, this is what gets critiqued by the people who don't like woke. Yeah. This basic aversion to power structures and a desire to dismantle them, or, you know, in some way challenge them, dynamite them, root round them. Yeah. And I don't. Maybe people are better at it now than I was, or maybe not. I don't know. But in any case, having tried very hard to avoid or dynamite or dismantle or destroy power dynamics wherever I found them, I found that really et in Arcadia ego, they can't be done. Yeah. All that happens when you destroy overt hierarchies is that you end up with covert ones. Right. And that's the fundamental insight. And again, that was you know, every bit as shocking and disorienting as the original postmodern insight. It left me really grappling with how should we, if it's not possible to dismantle, if bringing power structures out into the open and challenging them explicitly doesn't make them go away, then how should we relate to power?
Yeah,
that's the question. I don't have any very definitive answers to it yet. But I decided to experiment with just trying to be normal.
Yeah.
To be normal. I was thinking, if being normal is in fact no worse where it comes to being imprisoned within these power structures, if it doesn't make any difference how hard you try and avoid all of these things, then why not just be normal? These people seem to be having a generally much easier time of it than I am. So I said, so I had to go at being normal, and it turned out that actually not everything which I'd been fighting against was, well, so some of the things which I'd been doing my best to fight against turned out to be not that bad after all.
Yeah.
And some of the things I've been fighting against, I still think are pretty bad.
Right.
But doing that thought experiment, what happens if I just lean into being normal? As somebody who's totally committed to the postmodern project, what happens if I just try do my damnedest to be normal and see what's so great about all the normal ways of doing things? As it turns out, there's lots to be said for lots of them. It turns out that having a stable home and a committed relationship is great, actually. And there's plenty more I can say about that. It also turns out that having kids is great, actually, and not oppressive at all. And it turns out, even as I discovered, that being a stay-at-home mum has a lot to recommend, with some caveats which I've addressed in the book. So why not just be normal? Turned out, well, I remember my grandmother saying to me when I was in my late 20s, I think you should grow your hair and get married, Mary. By which was basically, grandma-ese for, can you just be normal, please, Mary? It was good advice. You can be as, and it turns out that it's, if you do your best to look and act normal, you can be as bonkers as you like under the surface, and it's much, and it's less, it takes less effort, and in some ways you can be more eccentric.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I find that in many ways being normal is a kind of rebellion in many contexts.
Imagine wearing a dog collar must give you a certain amount of cover to be yourself as well.
I think so. I feel very rebellious. I'm married. I've got 4 children, and I'm a vicar in the Church of England. It's not, and I'm in my mid-30s. I'm broadly speaking what you would call conservative or traditional in my outlook. So I'm very, very unusual, but I kind of like that in an ironic way. It's kind of our thing on this podcast as well, to be perfectly honest. But I mean, this thing about power, it's really interesting to me, and I've seen this a lot. I mean, you said earlier that this kind of way of thinking about things has permeated the academy, which I've seen, but I've also seen that it's permeated the church as well. And I definitely saw this when I was at theological college. It seemed like everything was about this kind of question of power and the patriarchy and so on and so forth. And I mean, I guess when you were talking that, I mean, I really want to talk about your experience of motherhood. So I think it would be great to talk about that. But just one sort of, I guess it's an observation or a question, or I don't know really what it is. But it seems like what you're saying is that power, hierarchy, structure, all of these things, these are simply a fact. They are a reality, and they're reality not just in the human and human social world, but they're also a reality in the biological world as well. So all these hierarchies and these structures of power exist, and you've got to really accept that if you're going to live in the real world. And so I guess that's the first stage, and then I suppose, and I do have some thoughts about how this relates to marriage and so on. But I suppose the second stage is, well, once you've accepted it, then how do you hallow it? How do you make it something which isn't evil and wrong and bad, but how do you use it in a way which is good? Do you see what I mean? It's not really a question. I'm just throwing that out there to see what your response is.
No. Well, yes, is the short. I mean, this is the hard question,
right?
It's the hard question for the church, and I think probably the question for for people of faith, in my view. At the risk of getting sidetracked into theory, and I'm not a theologian, but I think there's a way back to some version of natural law via this route. But I don't think I'm not nowhere near theologically well read enough to be able to do that in all of its individual steps. But I think there's a way there.
Right.
I'm hoping that we'll get a theologian who's capable of reasoning that one out.
Yeah, that would be nice.
It would be nice because I think we can get there. I mean, if you look at, I look at how ecosystems emerge, and I just see the hand of God very straightforwardly. I mean, how could you not? It's just there.
Yeah.
And I don't see why we should be. I was watching this program, so I'm sort of skipping about all over the place at the moment. I was watching this program about chaos theory, as one does. My husband put it on, and it was this great scientist from the University of London, I think, who was doing a documentary about Turing and Mandelbrot and all of these guys who developed chaos mathematics. And they got from that to talking about evolution and the ways that different species interact with one another over the course of evolution, and cellular automata, and how these extraordinarily complex and beautiful patterns can emerge via really quite simple equations. And at every point they were saying, well, of course this is an unconscious process, and of course this is a blind process, and I'm like, well, you don't know that, do you? I mean, we don't know either way. At some point, I suppose, you either have the leap of faith or you don't. But I think there's a route back to the transcendent via an understanding of how meaning making isn't just something that we do; it's something that the world does in relation to itself. Yeah,
it's something inherent within the processes of nature, and as you sort of dive down deeper and deeper beneath the surface of things, as they do with chaos theory, or I think of something like the quantum theory or the uncertainty principle or whatever it might be. It seems like what they reveal is kind of on the surface this kind of seemingly chaotic and random world which we observe with our senses, but underneath it really something which is more like the Platonic realm of the forms. There's a kind of pattern and a beauty that underlies it, which is amazing. With chaos theory, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's something that can only be really be mapped after the event itself. It can't be predicted. But sorry, someone trying to ring me. But nevertheless, once it has been mapped, you can see these patterns and these forms which actually underlie everything. And to my mind, it seems like honestly, what is wrong with people? They ring once and you hang up, and then they ring again. It's like, so there's a pattern that underlies reality, and it seems to me to be quite the assumption to say that this is some kind of sort of I don't know, sort of epiphenomenal byproduct of a natural process. It seems to me to speak of a realm of being which undergirds and gives shape to this realm. I understand we're very very far away from feminism here. It's interesting.
Well, we're not actually. We're not
okay,
really.
All right. Okay.
I don't know if I can do the wormhole between them in 3 sentences. But in my view, is that feminism is really just one cut at the larger problem of how we make sense of our thrownness in the world.
Yes.
Specifically for women.
Yes,
but just to finish off that thought, Yuval Noah Harari, who is
lovely man.
He's the subject of multiple memes by the sort of Great Reset and paranoia discourse. Also an interesting and his conclusions about what is or isn't good are different to mine, but his analysis is similar in lots of ways.
Okay.
And one of his famous aphorisms is that modernity, the essence of modernity, is that humans decided to give up meaning in exchange for power.
Okay.
And I would propose that actually what we're talking about if you want to talk about trying to hallow this discussion of thrownness and meaning and the natural order, what's important to realize is that systems of power are systems of meaning. Right. That's just you're just looking at it inside out if you look at it as a system of power. Meaning making is exclusionary by definition, because if something means something, it can't mean all of the other things. The simplest level. If I'm one thing, I can't be all of the other things in the world. And the only way for something to be completely inclusive is for it just to be formless grey goo, right? So given that the world is not made of formless grey goo, all of its systems of meaning making are power, are systems of power. And what's happening and what happens in the course of modernity is just modernity is a commitment to seeing those not in terms of meaning, but in terms of power, and rather and wherever possible to liquefy those systems of meaning in exchange for mastery over them. In exchange for power over them. And I mean, that's really the trajectory, specifically in the context of women, and specifically in the context of the human body and the human soul, that I've tackled in some depth in the second part of Feminism Against Progress. Okay,
so let's just let's bring that to earth a little bit and clarify it.
We're doing the whole book backwards. This is great.
No, but it's fine. It's fine. It's good. I like the conversation going taking its own course. So to my mind, one of the key central distinctions you make in the book is between two different types of feminism, right? And you call them team interdependence and team freedom. And your kind of genealogical reading of feminism is that these have been advocated at different times through the industrial era, modernity, and so on. But really, it's team freedom that's won out. And by team freedom, you mean, and it relates. It's a far bigger issue than just with feminism, although obviously that's a significant issue in itself. But it relates to everything, really. But really, what it's about is about wanting to be free from limits, free from limitations, right? So I shouldn't be limited by the fact that I am a woman. That's the kind of the basic rallying cry of this kind of team freedom thing. And you juxtapose that with team interdependence, which I think is well, we can talk about that later. But I think that's kind of what you're talking about there, isn't it? This idea of being this sort of, it seems to me to be a really simple and yet clearly attractive idea that we can be free from any kind of limitations. Like, reality has no limitations for us, and anything which imposes a limitation on us, be it our biological sex, you talk about transgenderism as well, be it our gender or whatever it is, our body, the body itself, be it our social situation, be it our race or whatever it might be. These things just should not be a limit. They should not be a limit, and we need to just clear all this aside. I mean, is that the way you see it, or have I got that right?
More or less, yes.
Okay.
And obviously that's much bigger issue than feminism, but I would say that it's via feminism and in the women's movement that's probably been most fully developed,
right?
Come most fully to fruition.
Okay.
And I mean, very, very simply, the story that I've told is of the women's movement emerging as a just and appropriate response to the way women's lives changed under industrialization, essentially because work left the home, and women's equal economic engagement in the work of a productive household was replaced by a new set of dilemmas depending on your economic situation, and so on, about how to meld getting by with the care of children, which threw up a whole previously not a whole new set of questions about women's participation in public life, women's legal standing, women's how marriages worked, and women's legal personhood, and also of the relative importance of participation in the market or the obligations of motherhood, all of which had been understood quite differently before, because they hadn't seemed to be so the tensions just hadn't been there in quite the same way. And in the course of that, what I call the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom both emerged. Now, the way the story is told by feminist historiographers, what I read as the feminism of care doesn't stand out very sharply, because most of it just isn't interpreted as feminism now. The entire cult of domesticity, quote unquote, or what's been slightly critically called the cult of domesticity, which was women's writing to valorize the domain of the domestic domain, the sort of bourgeois housewife, and so on. All of that to me is straightforwardly, it's a version of feminism that's saying, no, actually this stuff still matters. It's a bit different to the way it was when we were all peasants, agrarian peasants, but keep raising children, creating a nice home, caring for children, the moral education, particularly of children, was taken very seriously by these writers. All of this stuff is really important. And creating a space that's a space outside the market is also really important. And then there was the other side, who also, for very legitimate reasons, not least, that the cult of domesticity only really works if your husband isn't abusive, or neglectful, or drunk, or impoverished, or whatever. Said, no, actually, what we need is not this sort of second class support human role where we're entirely at the mercy of our economically all powerful husbands who could just who can be tyrannical, and here are some examples. What we actually need is the freedom to participate in this new form of public life on the same terms as men, and then sought to address all of the again new problems that this threw up for women. Where children are concerned, by suggesting, for example, socializing the domain of the home. I think the Marxist feminists were particularly keen on this, but also Charlotte Perkins Gilman was suggesting in the late 19th century centralized kitchens and creche facilities so that women could get on with girl bossing, I guess.
Gestational communism, you call it.
That's Sophie Lewis's phrase. I mean, she
is that her? Oh, okay.
Proposes this, she sees all of this, but thinks it's good actually.
Well, because why would you go? Why? What could be more attractive than to go through 9 months of pregnancy, and the absolute havoc that wreaks on your body and the pain that you go through, if not to donate your baby to the state? I imagine that's a very attractive prospect to lots of women.
The Law Commission is doing its best on that front, even as we speak.
Really?
They're proposing a change to the law, which would. I don't want to go down this. Commercials. They're pushing for commercial surrogacy in the United Kingdom,
right?
Essentially.
Yeah.
They'll change the law such that a baby that's been commissioned. Should be presumed the property of its parent, of its commissioners from birth, rather than with a waiting period of a couple of weeks during which the birth mother is still understood to be legally the mother.
Okay.
Which, as a feminist, I suppose, who takes care seriously, I'm not keen on this at all, as you can imagine.
I can.
Because I stand for the given relationships and the given nature of our embodiedness as women.
Yeah,
and I think any law that sets out explicitly to undermine the givens of womanhood is profoundly anti-feminist.
Yes, yeah.
But I'm getting off track.
No, it's great.
I mean, really, what we're talking about, really, again, it's of the feminism of freedom set out to give up meaning in exchange for power, and by meaning I mean those ways in which being a woman came with a given set of social roles and so on. And the feminism of freedom really is about challenging all of those. To the extent that our lives become meaningful by being bounded, but become freer by being unbounded. Or that we gain more autonomy by being unbounded, which is sometimes true. It's a worked example of giving up meaning in exchange for power.
Yeah. Well,
it's giving up the meaning of motherhood.
Yeah.
And meaning of femaleness in exchange for power in ways which now a new generation of gender critical feminists has some questions about.
Yeah.
And I mean that's sort of the point I got to by the end of part 2, I guess. Whether in fact we reach a point where we've given up so much meaning in exchange for power, and actually what we need to be looking at is where in fact that meaning was still important to a lot of people, and who's ended up with the power. and who doesn't have any.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about the question of freedom, it seems to me that there are two distinct understandings of freedom that are at play in a conversation like this. Maybe more, I don't know, but one of them is definitely about freedom from limitation. You know, having no boundaries and being not obligated to anyone or anything. But then there's another form of freedom which is I'd identify in the Christian tradition, definitely, which would be about the freedom to be the thing that you are meant to be. You know, like, so as a human being, if you're meant to be a certain thing, you've got a teleology, you've got a kind of ends, you've got a purpose, and to be free is to live towards that purpose and to inhabit it. And this is a type of freedom which we all recognize, even if we never articulated it. When you look at something like a skill, you know, like being a musician or something like that, you're not free to play the piano unless you've actually become a musician, you know, and then you're free, you know. So it seems to me like there are two different versions of freedom which are profoundly well, I don't want to say at odds with each other, but they're profoundly different. And when you apply this to questions of the family and children and things like that, it seems to me that if you operate with that first understanding of freedom, you're going to have a real problem being married and having children, because you're not free. I mean, I've got 4 children, and I'm not, and my wife and I have four children. I shouldn't be so possessive and patriarchal, but you know what I mean. I'm not free at all, hardly ever. You know, I have to constantly serve my wife and my children, but in not being free in that way, I'm becoming free in another sense, which is that I'm becoming free of my own selfishness and my own egotism and my own sin. You know, my own desire to think about myself all the time. And being a parent exposes these things and changes you, and then you're free from all those things, and that's what bondage really is. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
It does.
Hi everyone, it's Reverend Jamie here, just interrupting my own interview to bring you this short message. You'll notice we don't have any adverts on this podcast. We don't want to be selling things to you or in the pockets of any corporations or anything like that. We want to give you this podcast free and as a gift, but we are coming up to a time when you have a really exciting opportunity to partner with us in the next stage, the next phase, the next step, if you like, of this podcast. I am coming towards the end of my curacy, and for my next job in the church, I'm continuing to be a vicar, but I'm actually going to take what's called a house for duty post, where I'm given a house by a church, but I'm not given a stipend, which is the salary. And so I work part-time for the church. They give me a house, but I have no salary. Now, part of the reason we've decided to take this step is so that I can do a little bit more work on the podcast, and so that I can do a couple of other things in terms of public engagement. So it's really exciting. It's an exciting time, but it also represents a challenge as well. We're wonderfully supported financially by the listeners and viewers of this podcast already, and that's why we felt able to take this next step. But what I'm asking people to do in the run up to this next step, which is happening in June, is to consider, if you enjoy listening to this podcast or watching it, to consider becoming a supporter, a financial supporter of the podcast. Now, I understand not everyone can do this, but on Patreon, we've made the tiers go all the way down to £1.50 a month. So even if you could only give that much, that would be a wonderful thing to do. So the two ways you can give really are, you can go on patreon.com or you can go on buymeacoffee.com. And both of these there are big buttons on our website. So it's really, really clear how to do it. irreverentpod.com, big red button for Patreon, big yellow button for Buy Me a Coffee. And either become a monthly sponsor on Patreon, or just buy us a coffee, virtual coffee on Buy Me a Coffee. That's a one-off thing, and you can leave us a message on there. But what I'm asking people to do is just to consider how much this podcast is worth for you, as far as you're concerned. If you think this is worth, £2.50 an episode, you might want to consider sponsoring us for £10 a month. If it's worth less, then less. If it's worth more, then more. Just whatever you can do, whatever you can give to support us is warmly appreciated. And part of the reason we're doing this is because we want to see what happens. We're taking a step of faith. We're excited about it. We want to see where this thing could go in the future. So don't just listen or watch, but partner with us in what we're doing. Go on our website, reverendpod.com, click on the button for Patreon or buy me a coffee, and support this podcast. This podcast is financed by you, the viewer and the listener. We're not beholden to corporations. We're not selling you products. We're not doing anything like that. We do have the ads switched on at the beginning of YouTube videos just because they're skippable, and that seems like an easy win. But essentially, this whole thing is financed by you, and almost everything that we make from the podcast comes from generous supporters like yourself. So if you're watching this podcast or listening to it and you're thinking you want to help, please do. irreverendpod.com. Go on there and support this podcast, and let's see what happens in this next exciting phase. Thank you very much, and back to the interview with Mary Harrington.
My sense is that that somewhere beneath the birth rate crisis, which we're now talking about a lot, far more than the cost of living, that dilemma is somewhere at the heart of it.
Right.
Is which version of freedom are we actually talking about?
Yeah.
Which version of the good are we actually pursuing?
Yeah. So, Mary, can you tell us, because we haven't really even mentioned it, but you speak about it a lot in your book, about becoming a mother and that being a significant thing. You talk about the way it challenged the sort of liberal presupposition that you had, that you were sort of radically separate, or that you could continue being radically separate as an individual in the world. And then you had this experience of having a child.
It was a very concrete and very embodied, very literally visceral challenge to the belief I'd had up until that point that women really could be ideal liberal subjects on the same terms as men, which is the basic premise, I suppose, of the feminism of freedom. Right. That women can and should have the right to enter the market on the same terms as men. And motherhood threw this into question for me, because the ideal liberal subject, the market, Homo economicus, if you like, we sort of take for granted but Homo economicus is sort of atomized by default, and only opts into relationship, or transaction more often, and does so in his own interests, and I use his deliberately here, and the problem with trying to be that whilst also being pregnant or the mother of a newborn is that it doesn't compute, doesn't make sense. There's no sense. It's just not meaningfully possible to say even really that I'm a separate person when I'm carrying another person in my literal entrails, who's affecting my ability to move around comfortably, but who's obviously I didn't experience that as an inconvenience, except that it was an inconvenience.
Yeah,
but it was a very welcome inconvenience.
And something that you're willing to take on. Right. I mean, I'm speaking not from personal experience, obviously, just from what I've observed. Of course, it's an inconvenience.
But the point, this isn't just an emotional. This isn't just something which happens up here. The science is all. They've done plenty of studies on across species, but on humans and on mothers of other species as well, which show that sense of being not quite one person, not quite two person, it has an embodied component as well. I mean, you share a blood supply with your baby while they're in utero. There's an intricate dialogue of back and forth between my emotional state of arousal while I'm pregnant with a child and my baby's. They've tested this, so you can sort of disturb a baby in utero and the mother will have a sort of secondary response to that, and vice versa. If you agitate the mother, it will have an effect on the baby. I mean, these are all things which are generally understood in common sense, and everybody just kind of quietly goes on knowing that that's the case, and quietly doing their best to think about the fact that this can't coexist easily with the idea of the radically atomized liberal subject. Yeah, and that we just sort of we just bracket that and we say, well, okay, let's just. But again, being the kind of unfortunate who takes ideas very seriously, I found myself thinking a lot about this. Yeah, and thinking, well, is this a problem? Is this a problem with women, or is this actually a liberalism problem? Yeah. And I decided that, given that there's no other way of having children, and that having children is probably more important than having liberalism, it was probably a liberalism problem.
Yeah. Okay, so
and
that's
and
good.
that started me down a whole nother.
Yeah. Well, that's where I want to go. So where do you go then from there when you've decided there's some? I mean, this is a pretty basic tenet of liberalism, isn't it? That it's about this kind of individual autonomy, this individual freedom, this radical separateness, and so on and so forth. It's pretty big. It's a pretty big part of
foundational.
Yeah.
Kind of the big idea. I mean, Rousseau said the quiet part out loud all the way back in the 18th century.
Yeah.
I mean, he said that he explicitly excluded women from his ideal liberal subject.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
He said, we should just be charming, compliant support humans.
Yeah.
Because reasons. I have no idea why. I can't remember why Rousseau thought that. But
yeah.
in as much as women gestate, we just don't fit the paradigm in the same way.
Yeah.
And as a feminist, I'm more inclined to say that's a liberalism problem than that we should accept liberalism and that this is a women problem.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I get that, and I'm believe it or not on the same page. But where do you go? Where do you go from there?
Well, I set about trying to make sense of trying to reread everything which I'd thought about feminism up to that point through this lens, and I came to the conclusion. I ended up with this sort of materialist reread of the history of feminism.
Okay.
Something which emerges as much from the interaction of new material conditions with legacy cultural and political realities. Which produced this very rich dialogue between interdependence and freedom. And which culminated in the final victory of freedom over care in the mid-20th century, and the new era that propelled us into, which is the one I suppose I've spent the most time on in the book, which I call the cyborg era, which elsewhere I've called the transhumanist era, which to my mind feminism becomes less the appropriate the right and just and appropriate response by women to changing material conditions. It becomes something more like a stalking horse for a program of radical libertarianism of the body, which to my, as I've argued in the book, this libertarianism of the body doesn't benefit women. It doesn't really benefit anybody apart from a very small elite, and it serves mostly the interests of the market.
Right. Okay.
So where do you go from there with women? I think I believe that we need to reground our sense of women's interests in the realities of our bodies. I mean, in as much as, and I don't mean by that we should retreat to a sort of crude sex determinism, but that we just need a bit more of a measure of realism about the givenness of our bodies and the fact that it's just not possible to abolish human nature the way the transhumanists claim that we can and should. Not only is it a stupid idea, but it's going to produce even more grotesque inequalities, and it's not in fact going to be of any benefit to women, with the possible exception of, I don't know, Elon Musk's baby mama, maybe. That's pretty much it. And it'd be a disaster for everybody else.
Okay.
And against that, I've proposed a personal campaign, or an individual level campaign for greater realism about our embodied sexed selves, a defense of motherhood, a defense of femaleness. Our bodies are fine as they are. We don't need tech fixes. And I think we should be starting from that basis.
So I mean, it's not the same thing as the kind of cult of domesticity writing at all, but there is a sense in which it's more like that than the sort of feminism that we're used to today. Insofar as you're saying, we need to celebrate. I don't know about celebrate. I don't really like this word, but we need to promote what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother, and these need to become positive things again, and not sort of arbitrary limits which we push back against. Sorry. Is that broadly speaking correct?
Well, I certainly struggle to see how we can retain any standing for a great many things which really, really matter, for such as the given bond between a mother and a baby, unless we're willing to do that.
Okay.
Which means really flying in the face of nearly the entirety of culture, of the sort of general direction of travel, the culture in its entirety. But I don't see how we can defend the interests of babies manufactured to order in Ukraine, or indeed the women who are economically or even perhaps just literally coerced into renting out their uteruses or any other body part. I don't see how we can defend those women's interests unless we're willing to know what a woman is.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, this has become absurdly a point of mainstream political debate. Can you define woman?
Yeah.
Unless we're willing to try, with the attendant risk that will sometimes impose limits where we wouldn't like there to be limits, we're not going to be able to defend any of those things. And it is my contention that finding ourselves in a position where we can't defend any of those things, it won't just be bad for women, it'll be bad for all of us.
Yes, well, absolutely.
It's another step down the slippery slope to sort of grey goo culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many things I want to. There's so many sort of directions I feel like I could go in this conversation, but I suppose I'm very interested in the chapter about men in the book. I think that's not to be too egocentric, but that I think is a very important thing, and it's something that I see as absolutely crucial in this whole question. Is, well, I mean, you can try and come up with solutions to how to make things better in terms of the relationships between men and women, but I mean, fundamentally, if you accept reality, as you say in the book, if men want to abuse and mistreat women, they will, because they can. Women can protect themselves, and but if a woman entrusts herself to a man in marriage or in a relationship of any kind, really, the man can abuse her because men are physically stronger. I mean, women have power as well. It's a different type of power, but they have power as well. But men have that sort of visceral power to destroy, physically destroy and hurt. And I guess, I mean, here's just to share something of myself, and this won't surprise you, but it seems to me that this is where Christianity is so helpful, because I am as a man and as a husband, I am addressed by God and told, you must not use your power, you must not use your strength for that. You must use your strength to protect people who are vulnerable, most significantly your wife and your children. And that's what, and anything else would be abusive and wrong, and would incur the judgment of God. And the image, to my mind, the most powerful image of marriage in Scripture is given by the Apostle Paul when he talks about the husband's role being analogous to that of Christ giving up his life for the church. That's what I'm called to do as a husband, is to give myself like that, to die for my wife, not to abuse, not to use my strength to hurt or harm. And I don't know, I guess this is kind of one of the things I really wanted to ask you about, because I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm not saying that this solves everything, but I am saying that to my mind, that kind of metaphysical framework is the only way I can sort of feel really positive about marriage and the relationships between the sexes more generally. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there just to see what you think of it, really.
Yeah, I haven't spent. I think I've sort of sidled around the whole really important question of Christianity.
Yeah.
In the book. I mean, I'm sort of subtweeting Catholic social teaching at a few points, I guess.
Yeah.
Somebody accused me of climbing the north face of the Vatican without ropes or pythons. I think it's
interesting.
Quite a good description.
Yeah.
But anyway, I did that for honourable reasons. I just didn't want to blow the book up.
Yeah,
and
sure.
there was a different case I wanted to make. But I completely agree that it's very difficult to. It's increasingly difficult to make the case for marriage and for mutual honour in those relationships without the Christian framing. And actually, this is a point that my friend Louise Perry made recently. She wrote about the relationship between Christianity and feminism for I think it was in First Things.
Right.
She was talking about the extent to which it was the Christian faith actually which tamed a very aggressive set of sexual norms which had been current in the Roman era, which
absolutely.
really, didn't distinguish. It didn't have a concept of heterosexuality as such. It divided people into fuckers and fuckies, if you'll forgive my language. And the people who read as people were, if you were a fucky, you were just not a person by definition. And non-people were the ones who were to be done too in that way. And it was really the Christian understanding of sexuality which first made the injunction on men to constrain their sexuality and to sanctify it, really, in the context of marriage. And Louise's point is that much more than really contemporary, at least, feminism wants to acknowledge of the moral framework which underpins women's critique of rape culture, for example, is founded on that Christian framework. And to the extent that that feminism in its contemporary form sets itself against Christianity because patriarchy, or because Christian patriarchy, yada yada. They are effectively sawing off the branch they're sitting on. And Louise's line, which I think really captures what we're talking about, is if you hated Christian patriarchy, you're going to absolutely hate post-Christian patriarchy. I think where this relates to what I was writing about in the chapter on men, there are whole swathes of the internet badlands which I haven't spent very much time talking about, because again, you could just go on forever, and it gets a bit much after a while. But there are great swathes of the internet badlands which are fully committed to bringing back post-Christian patriarchy, or they'd see it as pre-Christian, but they're where the masculinist ideology is explicitly constructed, in opposition to the Christian idea of complementarity and mutual service and sanctifying sexuality within marriage, and where the aim is explicitly to return to the fucker and the fucky, and the unpersonhood of the fucky. I do wonder sometimes whether feminists are fighting the wrong enemy. Or really that they end up conflating ideas and groups of ideas, particularly those that come out of Christianity, which are actually at a deep level on their side, on our side, with a set of others which pose a much more insidious danger.
Well, I agree with that, Mary. I just jump in. I mean, the if you have a metaphysics which basically says that underneath everything is just a play of competing forces, and that's the true expression of reality, and that we have to sort of mirror that in our social dynamics, you are going to end up with that. You are going to end up with a post-Christian patriarchal structure, because men have power which women don't have. It just seems to me to be. I mean, I completely, I haven't read that article by Louise Clare. I've read her book, but I completely agree with what she's saying. I think she's 100% right. Sorry, I interrupted.
As the expression has it, a Smith and Wesson beats four aces. At the end of the day, the person who can bring the violence is the one who's going to win. And unless there's some ideological basis unless there's some other framework, a metaphysical framework that modulates that in some way, that's the situation you're going to end up with. And I suppose one of the ways I could critique my own argument, my argument in the chapter about letting men be, is that in fact, if we want to take the idea of a bit more realism about sex and our embodied nature seriously, that also means being willing to count some of the undercounted costs of the feminism of freedom, one of which was making all of society co-ed, or the drive to make all of society co-ed, and that it was with the laudable desire to grant women access to all of the social spaces where power had been brokered before. But one of the side effects of that was eliminating all male social spaces, as good as, or undermine a campaign against the legitimacy of all male social spaces, if you like. I mean, it's not as though men don't go off on golfing holidays or stag weekends. This still happens, but I think there used to be a great many more of them, and certainly further down the social scale, I think that's been a tremendous loss. And although I can't prove it, my hunch is that it has a contributory role in the very marked the far greater prevalence of mental distress and suicidality, especially in working class men. Especially as men get older, everyone talks about the male loneliness crisis and the male friendlessness crisis, which has been steadily escalating over the last few decades, to the point where the group at greatest risk of suicide is recently divorced middle-aged men, because for the most part they access their entire, in as much as they had a social life, they accessed it through their wife. And they didn't have a group of male friends as such. And I think if we're going to take the idea of sex realism seriously, we need to be able to step back and just say there are times and places where men need to be men amongst themselves. And one of the pushbacks you could offer against that would be, doesn't this just grant men carte blanche, well, at the top of the scale, to power broker without women? For one thing, but also further, to incubate the kind of noxious misogynies, which then end up in exactly this kind of post-Christian patriarchy. And I say, well, it's not as though those noxious misogynies aren't incubating now. You don't have to spend very long spelunking in the internet badlands, or indeed looking at the output of somebody like Andrew Tate, to see that those noxious misogynies are percolating perfectly well now. And it's my anecdotal observation, in as much as you want good men to become good men rather than selfish man children, that won't happen by women telling them what to do. It happens as a consequence of them being around other good men. Yeah, it does. That just seems to me to be observably true. In a male environment. And I don't really understand the mechanisms for that, because I'm not one. But it's clear enough to me that that's just how it works. And to the extent that women want good men, and there's a self-evident, there ought to be, the feminist case for good men ought to be self-evident. Of course. In as much as we'd like good men to marry or to be around, or just not to be attacked by on dark alleys. To that extent, we need to be willing to take the risk of letting men be just a bit, a little, and to perhaps quite a bit more than we do as things stand. I think I completely agree, and I just think men need to be addressed. They need to be addressed by older men and authoritative men. They need to be told what to do. I mean, we really do. We need to be told what to do, and men respond to that. I mean, I'm getting to the age now where I can speak to younger adult men in that way, and I recognize a big difference when I'm sort of soft and fluffy and cuddly, and I just hear and I don't really challenge. There's a big difference between that and when I say something direct, because I see this thing when I say something direct to a younger man, invariably what I see is response, engagement, and you think, well, I'm going to offend this person, I'm going to upset them. And it really, if you do it in love, with genuine concern for someone, it doesn't work that way. Men need that kind of challenge. And I really do think, I mean, I'm convinced that's why people like Jordan Peterson are as popular as they are, because there aren't many people who come out and they just say, look, you need to do X, Y, and Z, like, do it now, and the results will be good. And the problem with the situation we have at the moment is that internet mentors aren't really good enough. Internet mentors don't cut it, because the problem, some of the advice that they offer may be perfectly good. A lot of the clean up your room is obviously good advice. Yeah, of course. What's not to like about that? But the problem with mentors of that kind is that they don't know their mentees exist. And that does something toxic to the relationship, which makes it very easy for less healthful influences to creep in. And I mean, I'd say, from what I've seen of Andrew Tate's output, about half of it is just perfectly sensible advice along the lines of clean up your room. And the other half of it is just this absolutely virulently poisonous misogynistic stuff, which seems to me to be inimical to creating and sustaining any kind of worthwhile mutual solidarity with, which is ultimately, as far as I can make out, what people of both sexes desire and long for and would like to be able to build. So and if we're not going to if we're not going to have the Andrew Tates of this world sort of stepping into that gap, that there has to be a space for real world relationships, where where it's possible to speak in love, you know, in the, you know, in the context of a relationship to somebody else, and say, no, this is what you have to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can't do that unless the relationship is there in real life, and it goes both ways.
Yeah, it has to be real, doesn't it? Mary, let me just ask you a little bit further about this. So there were two moments in the book where I thought I've definitely got a question. So the first one, I think maybe we've kind of got towards an answer with this anyway, but when you talk about sort of solutions, you know, so one of the solutions, one of the solutions is about having, you know, sort of almost a return to the sort of cottage industry thing, but, you know, in a sort of updated you know, sense of people working, you know, in their own business at home, or, you know, on remote working and so on, and sharing childcare. I guess the thing I sort of thought about that bit is I didn't necessarily have a problem with it, and I'd support it, obviously, but is there a sense in which you don't really talk very much about the fact that you know, it's perfectly possible, and in working class context it's actually very normal to have the dad working and the mum staying at home with the kids, and for that to be just something that suits everyone and pleases everyone, you know,
Absolutely.
as an option. And then, sorry, I know you have to go. So let me ask the other question as well, and you can address them both.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask about the issue of abortion, because you seem to be sort of you in the book, you very much acknowledge the issue with abortion. You know, that it's very much sort of the outcome of a certain, you know, ideological way of approaching feminism and so on and so forth. And it seems to me you get to the point of saying, well, it's definitely a regrettable and a bad thing, but ultimately it would be not the best for women if abortion was illegal. And I guess what I thought about that is that well, firstly, it didn't really it doesn't well, you didn't mention the children who are actually killed when abortions happen, and also the issue of, you know, sex selective abortion and how sort of girls are killed when babies are aborted as well. So I just wanted to ask you about that. So sorry, I know you need to go, and there's a lot there.
No, it's fine. I've got a few minutes. We'll take them in order.
Yeah.
On stay-at-home parents and stay-at-home mothers. I mean, I guess the last section of the book was really challenging to write, because there's just so much to say, and what is to be done is invariably more difficult than you know, what's wrong. Yeah. I think everyone who tries to write a critique, you know, finds themselves flailing a bit more. And I felt very vulnerable actually putting all of that stuff down as well, because I was thinking, well, pretty much it doesn't matter what I say, somebody's going to hate it and tell me everything that's wrong with it. And in the end, what I decided to do was, rather than trying to keep everybody happy, because that it turned out trying to do that just made it too long and too boring. I thought, well, all I can really, at this point, I'm just going to have to be much more narrow about what my implied audience is. And throughout most of the book, I've got a fairly broad implied audience, which is probably characterized as my unheard readership, give or take.
Sure.
But in the last third of the book, in part 3 of the book, I've taken a much more narrow subset, really, of, I suppose, knowledge class young women who are still young enough that their decisions, young enough to reach escape velocity from, you know, from cyborg feminism, should they wish to, and who are, broadly speaking, of the same level of class and education as me. And I've just, you know, I think I've pretty much spelled that out. And I've just been a bit more narrow about the focus that I've taken, because otherwise I was just going to drone on forever. And I was bumping up against the point where I felt like the book was long enough.
Yeah.
So yes, you're absolutely right to say that there are plenty of situations where in fact, you know, the trad, quote unquote, industrial era model works perfectly well. And I mean, not so much in the book, but elsewhere in my writing, I've said a fair amount about how inimical, how iniquitous, really, the sort of the Tory right liberal model of childcare for everybody is feminist, blah blah blah, is actually terrible for those women who have jobs rather than careers.
Yeah.
Because it's just it's sold as liberation for everybody, but in fact, if you're being liberated from watching your baby reach his or her first milestones in order to put packets through a scanner. I struggle to see what's so great about that, except that Jeremy Hunt gets to see line go up, maybe. And and as a very committed advocate of of babies being good, actually, I dissent from the idea that there's anything good about that. So yes, absolutely, I think it should not be beyond the wit of man to support or I think it's on a sort of general policy level. I think it would be great and ought to be achievable to be working towards families generally being able to survive on one income. Should they? I think that would just be generally that's just a good goal to aim for. And then if the caring parent reaches a point where he or she, and I say he or she deliberately, although it's usually she, wants to do other stuff in addition to that, then great. And if they want to do other stuff, if they want to do stuff other than that, other than mothering, all the time, then. But I think the presumption should be in favour of supporting that models, because I think the presumption should be in favour of all of those mothers who have jobs rather than careers. And I think we should be rethinking a lot of childcare policy from the vantage point of that group, who really are the majority. Rather than from the much smaller subset of elite women who have fun engaging, who have a much more difficult decision to make, I guess, between a profession that maybe they've spent five or 10 years training for, and where in fact, it's a different set of tensions and pressures. But I think creating a one size fits all policy on the basis of a fairly small subset of barristers is unjust. In general. So that for the first one. For the abortion question, I really wrestled with how to square this circle. I mean, I've made the point. My argument in Feminism Against Progress is that fundamentally abortion is a bad metaphysic. It's a very it's the keystone of the feminism of freedom in its sort of cyborg incarnation. It's the metaphysical keystone, and increasingly, actually, in American abortion debates, you see that it's taken on a kind of sacramental quality, which I find deeply disturbing in the way it's described and in the way it's framed. As a sort of something approaching a sort of ritual sacrifice for the great god autonomy. I find that profoundly disturbing. And it's travelled a long way in a very short period of time from the, I think, much more realistic and grounded and safe, legal and rare. And I mean, people of good faith can probably differ on whether or not that's just a slippery slope and there's no firm point of there's no firm standpoint on that slippery slope. I don't know the answer to that. But where I ended up coming down in the book on the question of what we do with that bad metaphysic and what we understand abortion to mean is in thinking, well, what would happen if what would happen if the pro-life maximalists got their way and it was just abandoned and it was just banned across the board tomorrow? And I was thinking what would probably happen would be a variant of what happened under Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania in, I think, the 1970s, where he made all forms of birth control and abortion illegal because he wanted to see the birth rate go up. And that didn't happen because social norms just take longer to change than that. And what happened instead was the horrific, assorted horrific deaths in backstreet abortions, and a plethora of horribly neglected babies. We've all seen the videos of the Romanian orphanage babies, I imagine. Just that horrendous crime against humanity. So I can't in conscience make the case. I can't easily make the case that kind of an abrupt change would be a pro-women one. I just can't. And given that, and yes, and I completely take your point about sex selective abortion. I've been very explicit in saying that just because I've been ambivalent about bringing down the ban hammer doesn't mean I therefore tacitly support the ongoing efforts of maximalists to legitimize ending a pregnancy at any time for any reason, which is that's a campaign which is coming here. Hamza Yousaf has proposed to enact that in Scotland, for example. He's bringing abortion maximalism to the British Isles, and so I think it's a fairly safe bet that discourse will be upon us in England as well before long. And I think that there's a very robust feminist case for resisting it, for the same reason as I resist commercial surrogacy, and for the same reason as I resist gender ideology. That it's a cyborg incursion on given relationships, which is profoundly in its wider outworkings anti-feminist, but not least because of the war it wages on the feminism of care and on the domain of care. But how I would prefer to approach the question of addressing what I think of as a very grave, I think ending a pregnancy is a very grave thing to do. How I would prefer to address that would be from the other direction. I think there's so much we could do as that ambivalently pro-life and ambivalently pro-choice feminists we could work on together in making the world a more welcoming place for the kind of interdependence that comes with pregnancy and motherhood. And I want to focus my energies as a reactionary feminist on that domain. And I'll step back from the question of explicit legal bans and leave that to people who are more up for a fight than me.
Yeah,
maybe that's mealy mouthed. Maybe I don't know, but I feel like I've declared war on enough people. And declared war on enough ideas in this book that I'm cautious. I'm cautious about. About how we approach this one.
Yeah, I mean, I totally appreciate what you're saying, and I think there's to my mind, a sort of legal question is a separate though related question to the question of the ethics of the action of abortion. And to my mind, I'm very, very clear on my view of the ethics side. I'm not really sure what that means in terms of legislation. I mean, clearly it doesn't mean aborting babies when they're about to be born and so on and so forth. But how that could actually play out, say abortion became extremely unpopular and the majority of people decided actually this is completely immoral and we shouldn't be doing this, then there would be a separate question about how therefore should that be reflected in legislation. And to be honest with you, I don't really know what the answer to that question is. So I acknowledge that it's a complicated one. But Mary, I know you have to go. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope we can stay in touch and maybe do something again in the future. But thank you for your book, which Feminism Against Progress, which I think is a real achievement, a really important intervention in the public debate on these issues. Brave, courageous as well, and wish you all the best with it. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much.
Okay, goodbye now.